Welcome to One Broken Mom, a podcast dedicated to raising awareness of mental health, parenting, and self-improvement. I am the host, Ameé Coney. One Broken Mom is not a family show. It is meant for adults and contains sometimes adult language. The topics I cover can be serious and unsettling to people. However, I do have a sense of humor laced with a little bit of a punk rock attitude. So if you're interested in real talks about real stuff by real people so that we can all get better together, well, then you're in the right place, and so welcome. Okay, everyone, welcome back to One Broken Mom. I'm bringing on a guest today that I'm really excited to be speaking with. We're going to be touching on a topic that many of you have heard before on the show, and it has to do with psychopathy and the mental disorder that is associated with that. I think as many of you at this point in time get, there's a lot of personal experience for me in this field, and also there's a lot of you that have had some relatively, different experiences with abusive partners, relational partners. And, I think it's always important to look at it from a lot of different angles, not only from the angle of the person that we're experiencing in our lives, but also how we connect with them, and so that we can understand how to do our inner work in this area. While I was doing some research on the field of psychopathy, I actually ran across an organization called Aftermath, and it is a foundation that was started in 2006 with the intent of providing services to therapists as well as victims and survivors of psychopathy. And through this research, I landed on Dr. Dave Kosson. Did I say that right? Awesome. Okay. He is a professor of psychology at Rosalind Franklin University of Medicine and Science, and his research focuses on cognitive, emotional, and interpersonal developmental mechanisms underlying the disorder of psychopathy. He's also the president-elect of the Society for the Scientific Study of Psychopathy, and he is one of the founders of Aftermath and served as its first president and is its current president. So welcome to the show today.
Thank you.
I
should mention, I'm not actually the president-elect for the Society for the Scientific Study of Psychopathy anymore. That was a few years ago.
Oh, okay. Well, then...
Now I'm just a past president.
Duly noted, everybody out there. I wanted to start off with, my going through and researching the organization. And I think, if I recall, the reason why I eventually came into your group was due to following a thread on Dr. Robert Hare, who is a part of the board of directors for this organization. And looking at his process of trying to come up with an assessment or a tool of measuring and determining psychopathy. And I'm curious though, this is an organization, when I run into domestic or relational abuse, a lot of organizations are actually started by survivors themselves, but this organization appears to be started by professionals in the field looking to do some changes. How did Aftermath come to be, and why did you end up starting it?
Well, I've been a psychopathy researcher for most of my career, and so I spend most of my time just trying to understand the disorder and what leads to the development of the disorder. But sometimes I would get phone calls or emails from people who were in trouble and were looking for help, and so I would always just say, no, I don't do that. I'm just a researcher, and so I became interested in seeing if there was some kind of an organization out there to help people in relationships with psychopathic people. And so I waited a couple of years hoping someone would start an organization like this, but it seemed like maybe nobody was going to do it. So that's why I eventually just did it myself.
And who did you bring into the organization in the early days to help you put it together?
Well, the first thing I did was I contacted Bob Hare, and I asked him if he would post a notice on his website because he's got a lot of references, a lot of research out there on his website, and I think it's widely visited. And so anybody who volunteered was welcomed into the fold, and people helped. And we started out very small, but then gradually I began talking about the organization at the meetings of the Society for the Scientific Study of Psychopathy. And so several researchers joined, as well as some of the survivors who had seen the posting on Bob's website.
Mm-hmm. Now,
growing since then.
What's your origin in here? Sometimes we follow passions because there's, a personal connection to it, or, some relationship, or we've been touched by it in some way. Did you have some experiences with psychopathy that kind of lured you into the field a little bit more and wanting to research it deeply?
Well, I I have occasionally run into people in my personal life who may have some psychopathic traits. Of course, in those situations, I haven't done comprehensive assessments or had the opportunity to do those. But I had a situation like that when I was first learning about psychopathy, and so it struck me as very interesting. The psychopathy was also interesting to me because it's been around for so long. It's been recognized as a syndrome since the early 1800s, and it seemed at the time, this would have been in the 1980s. There was really nobody saying they had an effective treatment for psychopathy. And so it seemed like an area where there was some important work to be done.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned something about, not completing a full assessment. And it seems like that when right now, in the presence of our lives, like myself and other people that have ran into somebody that they would assess as a psychopathic individual, we're not all trained. I know I'm not trained. I tell everybody right away, I'm not a therapist or psychologist. I don't have a PhD or an MD or anything like that. But, it does seem to be a condition that does rely on either some assessment by an external person, because psychopaths aren't really willing and able to sit down and be tested and verified. You can go to a doctor and have your heart checked out, and the doctor can look at you and say, yeah, you've got heart disease. So how is psychopathy, and whether a person actually has it, how is that actually determined?
Well, right, we have to distinguish between the clinical assessment of psychopathy and maybe the more kind of informal screening that people do when they're concerned about somebody in their lives. In terms of a clinical assessment, there's really one approach that's been much more studied than any other approach, and that's the psychopathy checklist approach developed by Bob Hare. He calls it an expert rater approach because people do have to learn a lot about psychopathy to be effective using his instrument. But people who have had the training are able to do a pretty good job of determining the extent to which someone really shows psychopathic traits based on an interview, typically a semi-structured interview that lasts an hour to 2 hours, and then a behavioral observation of the person, that is how the person behaves during the interview, and also some kind of collateral source, some kind of additional information about the person. Commonly, we conduct psychopathy checklist assessments for people who are incarcerated or involved with the criminal justice system. And so there's some kind of file material available, either compiled by correctional officers or probation officers, including sometimes police reports and victim reports and things like that. And there are a few different versions of the psychopathy checklist for different kinds of settings. For example, there's an adaptation for use with adolescents, the psychopathy checklist youth version, and there's a version that's called the screening version, which is designed to be used outside of institutions, but still when there is this kind of file or other collateral material available. In the real world, it's tougher. I wouldn't have confidence that all of the traits of psychopathy can really be recognized accurately by somebody without training. But many of them are straightforward enough that if you do learn about them, you can get a kind of a rough or informal guide, at least if you have the chance to observe somebody over time in different kinds of settings, and if you don't have strong personal biases that might blind you to what you're seeing.
Yeah. And that's again why I touch on this topic many times, is to actually educate people about them, because I'm sure, as you know, for the folks that reach out to you, it's devastating, when you've been impacted and harmed by somebody that is psychopathic. But I think the we all are subject to being injured and hurt in some way through life. We can't avoid any of that. The danger can be with dealing with a psychopathic individual is that it can hurt you physically, deeply, emotionally, financially. There's a whole range of really bad things that can happen, at the hands of these particular types of individuals. And there's this compulsion or this desire or belief that in some way they could change out of this, but they, and we'll talk a bit about this. And like I said, when I've talked about the subject, there doesn't seem to be a cure for it. And so the best recourse is to identify it and get away from it. And so, looking at this disorder and the people that are assessing it, like I said, it feels like it's usually somebody that's doing a self-assessment, or not a self-assessment, but just kind of like, okay, I'm with somebody here who's got these markers that are really making me concerned. How would somebody be able to determine or discern the difference between, let's say, if they're in an abusive situation or a controlling and unhealthy situation, between a psychopathic partner, and I don't want to call him just a different type of an abusive partner, but not all abusers are psychopathic. And so I think that, and some people do have the ability to be helped through therapy and self-awareness out of maybe some unhealthy patterns and abusive natures that they have. So what's the difference between that psychopathic person that your best chance is to get away versus somebody that could use some investment and some love and grace and working together in partnership towards healing whatever their dysfunction might be? Does that question make sense?
Yes. We know that people who engage in intimate partner violence are a heterogeneous group. They're certainly not all the same. And people are still trying to figure out the best way to classify different kinds of intimate partner violence or IPV perpetrators. But one of the distinctions that I'd say is very well validated is a distinction between people who only hurt family members versus people who engage in violent behavior towards, presumably loved ones and also towards strangers. And so it's sometimes called the generally violent or the generally violent / antisocial perpetrator. That type of person is more likely to be characterized by psychopathic traits. So that's one clue, is the person committing crimes other than this kind of blowing up or trying to control a partner or children. But I guess the other thing that we encourage people on the Aftermath site is if you become suspicious that there are things happening that don't make sense, or if you're getting hurt in ways that you can't easily explain, it may be worth just considering whether you may know someone with psychopathic traits. And so just learning about the syndrome and trying to do a kind of an informal assessment, and also checking in with friends, others who might be more objective than you are, if you're in a kind of an intense relationship, can be helpful.
Mm-hmm. Now, one of the challenges is the personality of a successful psychopath. I think I've seen something where the successful psychopaths are not the ones that are incarcerated because they've managed to develop some level of skills at staying out of, maybe getting in trouble legally, but still being able to not get arrested at some point, or, to avoid it altogether. And so the outside resources can sometimes be confusing and invalidating to somebody who may be witnessing some of the psychopathic traits, because the psychopath is really good at making sure that everybody else might see them a little bit differently. I wonder here, when people reach out to you then looking for assistance with this, what are they asking for then? I mean, what is it that they're coming to Aftermath wanting some help with?
We get all different kinds of requests. If you don't mind, I would like to back up and just mention something about what you said a moment ago.
Sure, please.
And then maybe come back to this. One of the problems people have when they are interacting with a psychopathic partner is that he or she can often fool other people pretty effectively. And so sometimes people will say, I go to my friends and I tell them what the kinds of things that happen, and they say, "Oh no, you must be mistaken. I've seen him. He's a nice guy. He would never do that." Or maybe you misunderstood him. So it's an extra challenge getting through that kind of effective impression management.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it definitely is. I agree with that. And so when people are coming to you for help at Aftermath, is it they're trying to figure out how to leave a situation? Or are they trying to figure out how to cure their psychopathic partner? I mean, what is it that they're hoping they can get some help with?
We have gotten both of those kinds of requests.
I can imagine, having been there. It's like, yeah, I feel that request. So
yeah. Sometimes it's how to get out of the relationship, how to protect oneself. Sometimes people have been physically abused as well as emotionally abused, and they sometimes feel that they're in physical danger. Sometimes there have been threats, even threats to end someone's life if they end the relationship, or other times threats to take possession of children. Or even in some cases to harm pets.
Yeah. I'm sorry. Continue. Go ahead.
Well, sometimes people are concerned about one of their siblings or one of their parents, or one of their children having psychopathic traits. And in these kinds of cases, they're not usually thinking about just, getting out of the relationship, but they're thinking, how can I somehow protect myself, given that this person's going to be in my life for a while?
Mm-hmm. And that's got to be a really challenging thing. Why do you think that they're coming, an individual who's looking to get out of a relationship? I mean, I know that there are domestic violence resources that are out there for leaving relationships and stuff like that. Do people feel that, that an organization focused on psychopathy has a better chance at being able to help somebody extricate themselves out of a dangerous situation? I'm curious because, like I said, working with domestic violence awareness, I know there's groups out there. So if you want to leave an unsafe situation, that they can come out to you. I'm just curious why they come and zero in, with Aftermath, for example, versus one of those places.
Yeah, I don't know why people come to us instead of to other groups. There's nothing wrong with going to a shelter or contacting a domestic violence professional if someone's experiencing this. It's absolutely, we would encourage people to do that. Sometimes people tell us that the people with whom they're working don't understand or don't believe them, or are being manipulated by the abuser. And so in those kinds of cases, it seems like often people don't really understand how psychopathy works. And so if someone wants to speak with a mental health expert who really understands psychopathy and is not likely to be manipulated, that can be one advantage of coming to us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I'm nodding for the people that are listening on the podcast, because I do agree with that one of the things that people equate, I think, domestic violence with is just physical violence, and that anything outside of the scope of actually being hit or pushed or shoved or stabbed or shot at or, anything like that doesn't count as abuse, air quotes around the word. But for people that have actually experienced, a purely psychological abuse, an abusive situation and controlling situation, that is then counterbalanced by an individual who knows how to hide that really well out there, it is a really troubling thing. And I can imagine, that it may feel like domestic violence shelters are not where you go, even though it's probably also where you go as well. But because of this disconnect between psychological abuse and, flat out being, hit and punched in the face by an abusive partner. Yeah.
One of the things we feel strongly about is that education about psychopathy is really a key to preventing violence and reducing harm. So to the extent that people who work in domestic violence learn more about psychopathy, we think that's really, really valuable. And if your podcast is able to reach people in that field, and it causes them to learn more about the psychopathic traits that are exacerbating the problems of some of their customers, then yeah, that'll increase their effectiveness.
I agree. And the other field too that just again, having gone through this experience myself, is the legal field. And that there is, the way the legal systems are actually set up right now, especially in particularly with cases of divorce and custody between a psychopathic partner and the rest of the family, is that there's a lot of ways in which the legal system can be used to further abuse people because of a lack of understanding of dealing with psychopathic individuals. And there's no restraint in the legal system around dealing with a psychopathic individual, in court or in civil proceedings in divorce courts. And that's been a strong, area for me, is to be able to wonder out loud how something like that can be changed and how that can be done. I had a conversation with a gentleman who's a philosopher, but also deals in the field of psychopathy. And we talked about forcing assessments onto psychopaths. If you suspect somebody, making them have an assessment so that you have a tool, because they're not likely to ever volunteer to be evaluated as being a psychopath, but yet it would be critical to know, especially in legal situations, for example, or criminal situations, to know that that's what you're dealing with there and how to handle that differently. Do you have an opinion on whether or not assessments should be mandated? Let's call it divorce. Should everybody sit down and be assessed before we start down a divorce case with everyone, so we know where everybody stands?
I don't have a desire to see everybody get assessed who gets divorced. But we do hear about a lot of difficult custody battles, and it seems that there's a general lack of knowledge by the people involved in family court decisions. So one place that I think we really need to see a change is child special advocates and guardians ad litem, and people who do those evaluations really should have mandatory training in understanding personality disorders. In many states, there's no requirement that they understand personality disorders at all. And so it's easy for those people to be fooled by someone who can really turn on the charm. But if they had the training, they would be much more likely to pick up on when an assessment of personality disorder is warranted. And again, psychopathy is only one specific personality disorder. There are other kinds of personality disorders. You alluded to narcissistic personality disorder earlier, which can also complicate the custody evaluation process.
Yeah, agree. And I've seen, some really sad stories of narcissistic partners dragging on and, situations, which just ends up hurting everybody because of this desire to win and be in complete and total control. And like I said, right now, the legal system has a lot of opportunities for that type of an individual to use the legal system to continue to perpetrate their abusive nature towards their partners and their children and everybody around there. Are you guys working specifically in the legal system? Is that one of the things that Aftermath is looking into, to be able to find ways to educate those that are involved in the legal system in that way?
I'm sorry to say we're not working directly in that. We're a registered nonprofit, a 501c3, so we're not allowed to lobby for changes in the laws. But we do try to educate people, and to the extent that that they become educated, we suspect that people will likely start to think about ways in which the system, could be fixed a little bit.
For sure. Definitely. Now, when we talk about the research around the characteristics and qualities of psychopathic people, I saw one of the studies that you had published on the website there was looking at the desirability and the courting phase in particular, which I think that, again, having talked about this topic a few times, that doesn't come as any surprise, in which we've already mentioned on this one, that the abilities of a psychopath to be able to persuade everybody around them how charming and desirable they are. If we have somebody that has made it through the courting phase with somebody, are there any clear warning signs after the glow wears off? I've seen something called the triarch model of like 3 major characteristics of psychopathic people. Is that something that someone should, again, once the buzz wears off of the dopamine and serotonin rushes of dating, that they can start to look for in a person to make sure? And I ask this question, I'll put my hand up here so everybody can, see. My reason is that there are folks, present company included, that have ended bad relationships only to go back into another similar type of a relationship until they recognize that there is a pattern to their choices and in the selection of partners. And sometimes and I'll say the we word here so that nobody feels like it's, finger pointing, we will choose pretty similar folks over and over and over again. And so that's why I'm asking this, is because I for somebody that feels like they've had chronically bad relationships, for them to sit there and go, what should I actually be looking for now once I get past that courting phase?
Yeah, well, boy, there are a lot of things I'd like to say about that question. If I can, I'll divide it up into a few parts. The first thing is, I think people should not blame themselves if they've chosen some bad partners, even more than once. And then we can talk a little bit too about things people can spot in their own choices. But there is some evidence that that people who try very hard to manage someone's impression of them are going to be pretty good at it and can often be effective. So in other words, anybody can be fooled by someone who is high in psychopathic traits. And even psychopathy researchers are fooled sometimes. I've been fooled by people who come across very convincingly until I see the file. And since we don't usually get to see the file on the people we're dating, right, we have to be prepared that sometimes we'll be fooled. So I would say, one other thing I say about that, there's evidence that psychopathic people may be especially adept at spotting vulnerable people who it's easy to take advantage of. And so one thing people can do is they can assess their own vulnerability. People who seem physically unsure or psychologically unsure, people who are very high in compassion and trust, may look like easy marks to a psychopathic offender, and so it'd be easy to take advantage of. So that's one thing we can do. But even early in the phase or in the relationship, when the dopamine is still firing frequently, I think there are things we can look for, and so I'd be inclined to tell you a little bit about that.
Oh yeah, please do.
So one point that I've made before elsewhere is, if somebody seems too good to be true, it's worth considering whether, in fact, you're not getting an accurate sense of them, right? They may really not be what they seem. Mm-hmm. If I were trying to, really worm my way into your heart, right, I could react in a manipulative way, as if everything that you say is really interesting, and if all the things you're concerned about, I'm concerned about too. Right? And then all of a sudden it starts to seem like, wow, he really appreciates me. He sees my value and he feels likewise. You see what I mean? So, mm-hmm. So if you're not used to people, bowing down before you, right? I think the term people sometimes use is love bombing. If you're not used to somebody just talking about how you're the greatest thing since sliced bread, and then somebody's doing that, it could be, right, you've just found your soulmate, but it could be you're being tricked.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Love bombing has been used before, because once you recognize what love bombing looks like, you're just like, okay, this is over the top, Another term that I've also heard too, which you were describing, which is called twinning, which is they do, and that's been my experience, is that they seem 100% into everything that you're into and almost try to adopt it for a period of time as their own interests. And then after a period of time, they lose interest in that because now the hook has been set, and now, the rest of the, the needs or whatever they're trying to get going is, that's well on its way. But twinning, which is really powerful, and it's powerful, like, to go back to what you had talked about with the, don't feel ashamed that you pick somebody. My attraction was that love bombing did feel good because I didn't have a lot of the feeling good space inside of me for myself. And it did seem to give me the positive reinforcements that I needed emotionally at that time. So I was very prone and susceptible to being attracted to, like a moth to a flame, or a bird to a shiny object, and that was a lot of inner work that I ended up doing to, kind of protect myself from that. But it's very compelling, to be drawn into that by somebody. And when they do see you, and when I think about my experiences, yeah, I was at low points. Like I had a lot of glow, but yet I ended up being the most vulnerable when I was in a downslide, and, coming out of a divorce, or coming out of, some other thing that I needed to kind of pull myself up out of. I feel like that might be something for people to consider, is that when you're in a low point, to be a little bit more guarded, because you can be vulnerable to predators, in that way. Does that seem like that'd be kind of a fair thing to say?
Oh yes, absolutely. If someone's feeling especially low, then they may be really looking for someone to cheer them up, to take their point of view. And another thing is, in some ways, conning someone is very much like sales. Now, I don't mean to, I'm not suggesting that anybody who does sales work has psychopathic traits. I do not mean that at all. But some people really do turn on the charm when they're trying to make a sale. And so if I'm trying to sell you on me as a partner, one aspect of that is sort of projecting a sort of a happiness vision, right? A desired future that you're going to have, if you buy this product. And in the case of a partner, right? If you stick with me, we're going to solve your problems. It's going to sound good. So right. If you're in a downward spiral, that kind of thing, you're really at risk for glomming on to something that seems like a way to save things and make everything turn around. Mm-hmm. And I would encourage people to always have some affection for their impulses, but also be a little mistrustful of their impulses. Mm-hmm. Check this out. Is this really going the way I think it is, or am I being taken for a ride?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Which we cover quite a bit on the show for that reason right there. And social media, it kind of makes it easy hunting grounds for psychopaths because, depending on how transparent and open a person may be about where their current circumstances, when they put a post out there on Facebook that, this is my worst day ever, and will I ever find love or whatever, all I can sit there and think about is that if you've got the wrong people in your circle seeing, the messages that you post out there, the guy that ends up dropping you a private message in your message box saying that they're there for you, it's kind of like, you probably might be a little suspect, about that, because again, especially if you're broadcasting, a lot of low points. And it's terrible to feel that you have to be mistrustful. And I guess that's why learning about this condition, so that you don't have to feel like you can't trust anybody's intentions, because there are people with good intentions that really do want to step in and help you. So, how would we know the difference between somebody, again, that is a psychopath versus, a really warm spirited person who really just wants to be there, to help somebody through a low point. I mean, I don't want anybody to not trust, that everybody's, got good intentions out there.
Well, right. And this is another part of what you were asking a few minutes ago. So other things that you can do is you can, as you get to know somebody, you can check out how much you really know about someone. Is what you know mostly that they've reacted well to you, or do you also know what they're like as a person? And are you getting a sense that they are an independent person who's living a life, with their own issues, right? Desires, challenges, connections, resources. In most cases, as we get to know people, right, we see that they're complex, they're complicated like we are, and right, they've had victories and defeats, and things they feel really good about and things they don't feel so good about, and so when you get to know somebody, you can start to see, are there these layers, is there this depth, or does it, do I really feel like, wow, this person could be undercover because I really can't tell anything about them except what they're choosing to show.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Same thing with friends. As you get to know somebody, now everybody can go through a period, right, in which they've become alienated or isolated from everyone who used to care about them. But for the most part, there's continuity for most of us. There's probably a lot less stability and continuity for psychopathic people, right? If I have used everyone up in the situation I'm in now, it is time to get to a new situation where I can, get more favors, get more help from people who don't realize it's a one-way street with me. Mm-hmm. And so, so if you can get to know someone's friends, you can often get a sense for what they're like just by the kinds of people they hang out with and what their friends talk about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, those are really good points.
One more I want to throw out.
Oh, do it. Throw it.
Okay. People whose behavior seems vastly different from one context to another, that should be a warning sign. And again, yes, there could be a particular situation you didn't know about. He's vulnerable to this. He blows up under such and such. But for the most part, we don't change that radically from situation to situation. And so if someone seems completely confident at one point and then they just button up and they don't say another word in another situation, what's going on, right? Or if they at one point seem really solicitous of your feelings and really care how you're doing, and then at other times they seem like they don't even know you, or they're completely callous, right? It's probably not just that they're distracted. It's a really radical change you've noticed, and it's worth paying more attention to that. It could be, right, that they were trying very hard to manage your impression some of the time, but then they stopped, almost like the mask. People use the expression, the mask is no longer there, and then you see something radically different. When you see that kind of a big discrepancy, I would say, take another look at what's going on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One of the things too that I've noticed, and I'm guilty of kind of overlooking, which has a lot to do with honesty, and truthfulness in a person's actions, and being able to, not dismiss a person who has a chronic issue with lying or talking around the truth, and that's just a strong antisocial behavior, whether they're doing it to you, but then if you see them doing it in business, they see it doing to other friends, like that's a pretty powerful flag that sometimes a skilled individual can validate, why they said the lie or what they really meant, or they do, which we talk about when we're talking about narcissistic personality disorders. We talk about gaslighting. They try to convince you that you're somehow crazy or wrong or misinterpreted it, or they shift, the storyline just a little bit, to get you back in. But I can't say this enough. I really wish I had taken action sooner when I saw all of those inconsistencies in truthfulness and honesty, at a faster time. But the reason why, again, I do talk about this is because I didn't take action, and that's the important thing, is to know why, because that's how you get protected from ever making the mistakes again or getting yourself in the situation, which was this underlying idea that trying to be more loving and more caring towards somebody who has these tendencies can change them, and can make them a better person, which is kind of remnants of codependency, for how some of us may have grown up. And I guess what's important for me is, and for talking with experts like you, is that evidence is showing that psychopaths don't change, right?
Well, we don't know so much about this. But there's no evidence that people with psychopathic traits spontaneously grow out of it. And there's to my knowledge, no evidence that, being a good friend to someone who's psychopathic helps them to be less so. What you reminded me of is what I think is the worst advice I ever heard given to somebody who contacted the Aftermath Foundation. And I'm without getting into too much of the details, someone had been physically abused by a partner, and the counselor or therapist said, well, maybe you should just try compromising more with him and, being more understanding, and then maybe he'll stop abusing you. But if he's high in psychopathic traits, right, that is not going to work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. Yep. And that's why I think, like I said, I appreciate what your organization does and the research that you've done in there, and talking with me today about that, because it is important to really become knowledgeable about this. And I don't think that I can actually talk about this enough with people, is to try to show these different sides of this particular type of an individual, because the trap is spending years of your life and money and emotional resources trapped in with somebody that is never going to come around the corner, is never going to turn out to be your perfect partner, your perfect husband, your perfect wife. They are, it sounds so defeating, but you're not a lost cause. You still have opportunity to have a wonderful life, and to be able to disconnect from that and to recognize it. But also, like we talked about earlier in here, understanding that these people do exist out there. They are out in our world around us, so that we can support people when they have ran into these types of people, because we, just because we see, a really charming person over here that's really fun to hang out with, or, it seems to let you believe they're successful, doesn't mean that you can't have some truth, have some belief for somebody who's telling you that that's not the way that they really are, that that's not the way that they've really treated, a friend or somebody out there, because there is a lot of shame and doubt in the minds of people that have been abused, by these individuals, because they're fighting against the impression the psychopath is given to their friends and family and community or whatever it is. They're fighting back against the gaslighting, and this manipulation that this person's doing to themselves. And then you're just they're sometimes set in a trap, and you don't know how to get out of it. And it's a painful, experience, for many people. I think we've touched on this a little bit, but what is ultimately the best protection against psychopathy, and having it enter into our lives? Well,
I think knowledge is the best. Understanding the features of the psychopath, so that you can start to recognize when somebody has a lot of these features. Again, not that you can be qualified to make a clinical diagnosis, but if you start to see a bunch of these traits present, it really is a warning sign, and people should take it seriously. It's not necessarily the case that people with psychopathic traits cannot get better. There are some treatments that now have some promise for changing people with psychopathic traits, but really we're just at the beginning of seeing this. For incarcerated people, there is some evidence that being in certain kinds of treatment programs is associated with improved behavior, reductions in violent behavior. But even in those contexts, psychopathic traits work against the success of the treatment. So they still tend to contribute to people dropping out or engaging in behaviors that interfere with the treatment working. So I would say it makes sense for people to not be optimistic that someone's going to change. Certainly they're not going to change on their own. Mm-hmm. And short of being in locked up, right, where they have to participate in treatment every day, I don't think the odds are good. On the other hand, there are some treatment programs being developed for children now who are beginning to show psychopathic traits, and it looks like there's more reason for optimism in terms of getting kids into those kinds of treatment programs. It's still early days, but at least there's something. But anyway, back to your question, right? For people who are in one of these relationships, the best thing to do is if you can spot it, then you can reduce the amount of time you spend with this person. Depending on who else is involved, who's dependent on that relationship, it may often be best to get out when you can.
Mm-hmm. Are there good ways for a person to stand up against their psychopathic partner that works better than others, and are there things they shouldn't do, in terms of confronting a psychopathic partner?
I don't have any hard and fast rules about this, but there are a few principles I think that make sense. One is to build a support network. One of the things that we know is that psychopathic people often alienate people from their support networks. It makes it easier to maintain the manipulation and keep getting whatever goods you're getting from somebody if they can't figure you out or stop you. But so building up the support network helps you stay sane while you're fighting for your survival. It helps you check out what's happening to you and how much danger you're really in. Another principle is to document everything. In some cases, people are so slippery, but if you have cameras, if you can come across official records of things and then even make copies of them, it can help when you have to convince somebody about things later. Even things that just don't make sense. But for example, in custody battles, everybody views the person who wants to break up the marriage as biased. Everybody not objective, and so having documentation of somebody's run-ins with the law or bad behavior on the job, unprofessional conduct, things like that that are observed by others can be very helpful. I've known a number of cases in which people were documenting this kind of evidence, and then their homes were burglarized and they lost all their records. And so I always encourage people, if you're paranoid anyway, right? But if maybe somebody is out to get you, make a backup copy and store it somewhere else so that you don't lose all your records if you're burglarized.
Mm-hmm. Oh my gosh. And so as you were going through that, my chest tightened a little bit because first the alienation of your people around you is painful and real. And so I do know that you want to make sure you've got some really good people around you for that perspective, because they can be very effective at either charming the people around you or threatening the people around you, for their compliance or for them to go along with them. And, in the documentation, I will tell you, I cut my teeth in the professional industry as an engineer, and we document everything, probably over document everything, but it is invaluable. And the benefit legally, obviously, is that you've got evidence, and psychopaths tend to have zero evidence. All they have is whatever tale they're trying to weave for you. And the less paperwork they have, the better for them, because it allows them to use their words and their storytelling to relate some narrative that they want to press on. And so everything that you can have to support what you're doing, including even journaling an incident during the day, like today this happened and at this time, it's still you and your words, but yet that still allows you to be able to show that you were keeping track of those, those details. And the other thing, the other benefit that I don't think that people would realize is that I was able to use all my documentation and my facts as touchstones to my reality. Being able to go back and remember that I am not the insane person, that this really did happen. Here's the proof that, as I'm being confronted with another mischaracterization or a lie or whatever is being thrown at, that I could go back and find my email, go back and find a text message, go back and find the thing that said, no, this is just more of the manipulation, the more of, trying to incite doubt around you and in you. And that those facts can just be the thing that anchor you to your own sense of reality over what is really going on and really happening. And there's a huge emotional boost to that. I was able to tolerate a lot by having to know that there were still facts, on my side. So that
Yeah.
is a really important feature there for sure.
There's one other thing I would add. Sometimes people feel that they have to go up against someone who's psychopathic, or even that they have to get revenge or get even.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's generally a bad idea to try to get revenge.
Mm-hmm.
Because you can become the object that's most interesting to him or her, they can decide also to get even with you. And often they may care less about their reputation or their property or their place in the community, because they're going to bounce somewhere else. So they may be willing to risk more and be more reckless. But even in that context of not encouraging people to become the prominent enemy, or target, there's a way in which psychopathic manipulation often resembles bullying. And bullies are likely to take advantage of the people who are easier to bully. So to the extent that you are tougher to manipulate, even if you're not successful in standing your ground all the time, or setting up boundaries that don't get tested or broken sometimes, to the extent that you make it tougher, it's more likely that he or she will find someone else to go after and leave you alone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. And, to your point there of sometimes what the strongest thing that you can do for yourself is just to refuse to fight with them anymore, because they are fueled off of that conquest and that and the conflict itself. And again, you hit on something that I actually was kind of confronted with making that choice for myself in this last year, was the decision of do I need to prove myself anymore? I have the facts. Like I said, I had thousands of pages of facts, but it was at the end of the day, I will be drugged to the bottom of the ocean with this person, because like you said, whatever it takes means sometimes they'll risk a whole lot in order to come out. And, the risk to myself, I felt, was greater than the risk that he perceived was to himself. It's like, I didn't want to risk my future. I didn't want to risk my finances anymore. I didn't want to risk my mental health anymore for this. Like, none of this was worth it, at the end of the day, to prove anything. And so it was hard to walk. And there was a lot of people around me that said, gosh, but you deserve more. And it's like, it doesn't even matter. Again, like I talked about, like my realization was that the legal system allowed the bullying to continue, without, eventually somebody, you'd have to prove a case, or you'd have to prove it was correct or not. But you got to spend an awful lot of another person's money to, before proof even became a factor, because of just, again, the way the system is designed and allow it. So, it's a hard thing. One of my attorneys was like, you should come in and talk to other people that are getting ready to go into, court against somebody that seems to be unreasonable, to let them know the kind of the emotional metamorphosis that can actually take place, and probably, and for some cases should take place, that the courts are not always where justice is served. If you believe in the fact that the universe, does know how to keep the scales balanced, you can lose a few things, or perceived lose, air quotes around that, to win in the end. And it does take, in this case here with, these types of individuals, you do have to make some hard decisions of like, just put faith that there's a thing called karma, put faith in that exists, and that you don't have to be the person who has to dole it out to everyone around you. It's not always your job to do that. Take care of yourself, and, and maybe somebody else will, handle it for you. So what is Aftermath doing today, in the organization, for people that might be listening to this that maybe, again, in a relationship or trying to leave one, or are surviving, the aftermath, nice word there, of having a psychopath in your lives? What does your organization do?
Well, so we do a number of things, and I would encourage people to come to the website and check out the resources. You mentioned one of the resources earlier. We try to get accurate information about psychopathy out there, and present it in a way that people can understand it, even if they don't have advanced degrees in psychology or psychiatry. So that's it's a good place to learn a lot. One of the resources is based to some extent on a book called The Sociopath Next Door, and we talk on in that resource about how to deal more effectively with people who have some of these traits, and about some sort of pitfalls that people can avoid. So I encourage people to check that out. We also do provide workshops for therapists and for court personnel. And so if people want to organize a workshop, they can approach us about that. And also people contact us just to get help with their personal situations. We don't provide help ourselves, but we try, when people are looking for a therapist or somebody to conduct an assessment or testify in court, we try to find psychopathy experts in their area and connect them if we can. Right now, we're in the middle of a fundraising campaign, and so if it's all right, I'll mention just a little bit about it.
Yep.
We're running a Kickstarter campaign, only for I think another 12 or 13 days. We're trying to raise money to build 2 online courses, and these courses are designed to educate therapists so that they can help people recover from these traumatic relationships more effectively. And one of the courses is also designed just to educate the general public about psychopathy. So people certainly can check out our Kickstarter campaign. They can contribute if they want to, but once we have these courses, and we've already raised over the $10,000 we were trying to raise, so that's great. Okay. So I think we're going to be able to proceed and build these courses, but the more we have, the better we can do. But anyway, once these courses are ready, we would encourage people to check out this material, learn about psychopathy. They won't take very long, but they'll help people protect themselves better.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is such a wide-ranging thing, so it's hard to put definition on it. And I appreciate you taking the time, to sit in here and talk with me about this. I think the key overriding messages about the disorder is that it's an illusion. A person who's really good at providing an illusion of who they are and what they're into, but that really there is a disconnect from them into empathy and concern, for a person's feelings, and that their intent through whatever means possible, and sometimes it's often coercion and manipulation and lying and breaking the law or violence, is to just get what they want from you, and which makes them a particularly dangerous person. So the sooner we can identify them in our lives and guard ourselves to them, and then also work on ourselves, I think, to understand how that attractiveness can rope us in, and how we can, get out of it faster to avoid the destruction, that comes in the wake of an individual like this. I think the better for everybody. And so I really do appreciate that we were able to get our time together today to sit down and talk about this. So thank you so much.
Well, pleasure. It's a good cause you're working on.